"The house will be ours," my wife whispered to my stepfather. I let them believe they'd won. 3 months later, I showed them the real will. I'm 37 years old and never thought I'd be sharing this story with strangers. 7 years of marriage to Peggy, the woman I believed was my soulmate, ended in a betrayal so profound it shook the very foundation of who I am. But sometimes life has a way of revealing people's true colors when you least expect it. And in my case, it came with a silver lining of justice that I never planned but certainly welcomed. My mother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 3 years into my marriage. She was given 6 months, but being the fighter she always was, she lived for nearly a year and a half. During those difficult months, I watched as the vibrant woman who raised me single-handedly slowly faded away in her beautiful Victorian mansion, a home that had been in our family for generations and meant everything to her. 2 years before her diagnosis, my mother had remarried. Robert was charming, attentive, and seemed to genuinely care for her. I was initially skeptical. My mother was wealthy, and I'd seen plenty of men try to win her over for the wrong reasons. But Robert appeared different. He was already financially comfortable from his career in real estate development, and he treated my mother with a respect that seemed genuine. There were warning signs I only recognized in retrospect. Once, during a family dinner 6 months into their marriage, I overheard him on the phone, his voice hushed but intense, insisting to someone that they would get their money soon. When he noticed me, he quickly explained it was a contractor for one of his developments. Another time, my mother mentioned casually that some jewelry had gone missing, only for Robert to find it days later in an unlikely location. Despite these occasional oddities, I gradually accepted him as part of our family. When my mother realized her time was limited, she called me to her bedside. The conversation we had that day would later prove to be more significant than I could have imagined. "I've updated my will," she whispered, her once strong voice now fragile. "The house and most of my assets will go to you. Robert will be taken care of, but this home belongs to you. It's our legacy." I nodded, unable to speak through my tears. I didn't care about the inheritance. I just wanted more time with her. But my mother was practical even in her final days. She made me promise to keep certain details of her will between us and her lawyer, explaining that she wanted to spare Robert the painful discussions of a future without her. Out of respect for her wishes, I agreed. After she passed, I was too grief-stricken to focus on inheritance matters. Robert seemed equally devastated, and we mourned together. In those early days, I actually found comfort in his presence, someone else who understood the magnitude of our loss. Peggy was supportive too, organizing the funeral and helping me sort through my mother's belongings. At least, that's what I thought at the time. My mother's lawyer informed me privately that I had indeed inherited the mansion and the majority of her estate, but asked me to allow time before making any significant changes, out of respect for Robert's grieving process. I agreed, letting Robert continue living in the mansion while Peggy and I remained in our downtown apartment. We would visit weekly for dinners, maintaining family connections during a difficult time. The arrangement seemed sensible and compassionate. 6 months after my mother's passing, I began noticing subtle changes. Peggy, who had always been somewhat materialistic but endearingly so, became increasingly fixated on wealth and status. Our modest apartment, which had previously been a source of pride as we saved for our future, suddenly became embarrassingly small in her eyes. She began making comments about the mansion, how spacious it was for just Robert, how we could put it to better use. At first, I attributed these remarks to her way of processing grief, perhaps focused on practical matters to avoid the emotional pain. But then other peculiarities emerged. Peggy began having girls' nights that ran suspiciously late. Her phone would be face down whenever I entered the room. She began dressing differently, wearing perfume I hadn't purchased for her. Each oddity on its own could be dismissed, but together they formed a pattern that gnawed at my subconscious. Then came the coincidences. Twice I called Robert, only to be told he was at the gym or running errands, yet Peggy was mysteriously unavailable at exactly those times. Once, I noticed a receipt for an upscale restaurant in Peggy's purse, dated for an evening when she was supposedly working late, and Robert had claimed to be meeting with his financial advisor. I'm not naturally suspicious. In fact, friends have often teased me for being too trusting. But even I couldn't ignore the evidence mounting before me. When my best friend Marcus cautiously mentioned seeing Peggy's car parked near the mansion on a day she'd told me she was shopping with her sister, Something finally broke inside me. Still, I needed proof. I couldn't accuse my wife and my stepfather of betrayal based on coincidences and hunches. So I devised a plan. I told Peggy I was traveling to Chicago for a 3-day business conference, a trip that didn't actually exist. I rented a car rather than taking my own and staked out my mother's mansion from a discreet distance. Nothing happened the first day. I felt foolish, ashamed of my distrust. But on the second evening, just as I was about to give up, Peggy's car pulled into the mansion's driveway. Through my camera's zoom lens, I watched as Robert greeted her at the door, not with the casual familiarity of family, but with an intimate embrace that made my stomach turn. I sat in that car for 3 hours, photographing their silhouettes through the windows as they moved from room to room, eventually settling in what had been my mother's bedroom. The pain was physical, like someone had hollowed out my chest with a dull blade. But beneath the agony, something cold and calculated was forming, a determination to understand the full scope of their betrayal before taking action. Over the next week, while maintaining the facade of normalcy, I hired a private investigator. The evidence he gathered was devastating: text messages spanning months, photographs of hotel meetings that predated my mother's death, and recorded conversations that revealed the true nature of their relationship. Most sickening of all was their explicit discussion of the mansion and my mother's money, with Robert assuring Peggy that, once enough time has passed, he would reveal that my mother had left everything to him, not me. But here was their critical mistake. They didn't know about my private conversation with my mother or the arrangements with her lawyer. Robert had seen only a preliminary will draft from years earlier, and my mother had deliberately allowed him to believe that document remained valid. He also frequently referenced verbal promises my mother supposedly made about their future together in the mansion. What he didn't know was that she had quietly updated her will during her last months, after discovering some troubling financial behaviors. He firmly believed he was the primary beneficiary, with only a small portion designated for me. In reality, the opposite was true. When confronted with the evidence, both initially denied everything. Peggy cried, claiming the photos were misleading and the text messages misinterpreted. Robert attempted to portray himself as a lonely widower who had succumbed to a moment of weakness. But as I methodically presented each piece of evidence, their denials crumbled. "How long?" I asked, my voice unnaturally calm. Peggy's response cut deeper than I thought possible. "Since before she died." Their affair had begun while my mother was still fighting for her life. While I was splitting time between work, hospital visits, and home care, my wife was sleeping with my stepfather. The complete disregard for my mother's dignity and my own feelings was breathtaking in its cruelty. I didn't yell, I didn't break things. Instead, I quietly informed them that I would be filing for divorce and expected Peggy to move out of our apartment immediately. I told Robert I knew about the will, without revealing that I knew the truth, and that I wouldn't contest his claim to the mansion for now. My apparent acceptance of their narrative confused them. They had expected rage, a fight. My calculated calm was disorienting, which was exactly what I wanted. Let them think they'd won. The divorce proceedings began, and I strategically appeared defeated and disinterested in fighting for assets. My lawyer, one of the best in the state and briefed fully on my strategy, advised me publicly to accept Peggy's terms while privately preparing for what was to come. Peggy, believing that Robert would soon have control of the mansion and my mother's wealth, agreed to a relatively modest settlement, eager to be free to pursue her new life. Meanwhile, Robert began renovating sections of the mansion, clearly anticipating his future with Peggy. They became increasingly bold, appearing together at restaurants and shopping for furniture. My friends expressed concern at my apparent indifference, but I assured them I was healing in my own way. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, the estate formally entered probate. The timing was deliberate. I had requested a delay for emotional readiness, a request the sympathetic court granted. Now, with the divorce complete and Peggy no longer legally entitled to any new assets I might acquire, it was time for the will to be properly executed. I arranged to meet Robert and Peggy at the mansion, ostensibly to collect some remaining personal items of my mother's that held sentimental value. They were already discussing which rooms to redecorate as I pulled into the driveway. The confidence in their expressions as they greeted me, the barely concealed triumph, only strengthened my resolve. We gathered in the grand living room where my mother had hosted countless family gatherings. Robert began condescendingly explaining which of my mother's personal effects I could take, his tone suggesting tremendous generosity on his part. Peggy stood by his side, her hand possessively on his arm, a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before glittering on her wrist. I let Robert finish his speech before slowly removing an envelope from my jacket pocket. Inside was the true will, notarized and certified, along with the executor's documents that had been finalized that morning. "It was never his to give," I said quietly, placing the documents on the antique coffee table between us. "My mother left everything to me, not Robert. The house, the accounts, all of it. She made me promise not to tell you right away, Robert. She thought it would add to your grief." The color drained from both their faces as they read the documents. Robert's hands began to shake. Peggy's eyes darted between the papers and my face, searching for some sign that this was a bluff. "This can't be right," Robert stammered. "She told me." "She told you what you wanted to hear because she knew you were only after her money," I interrupted, my voice finally betraying a hint of the anger I'd suppressed for months. "She knew about your gambling debts, Robert. She found the loan shark notices hidden in your office. She knew you'd burned through your real estate fortune years ago, and those business calls were creditors demanding payment. She stayed with you because she believed you genuinely cared for her despite your flaws, but she wasn't going to leave her legacy in the hands of someone who couldn't manage their own finances." Peggy's composure cracked first. She turned on Robert, her voice shrill with panic. "You said it was all yours, you promised me." She stopped abruptly, realizing what she was admitting, but it was too late. Robert's face contorted with rage as the full picture emerged. "You were using me to get to the house? All those promises about caring for me, about how we deserved happiness after supporting him through his grief, that was all lies." Their unified front collapsed spectacularly as they turned on each other, revealing the hollow foundation of their relationship. I stood silently, watching years of deception unravel before my eyes. When their attention finally returned to me, I informed them they had exactly 1 hour to collect their personal belongings. Security personnel, hired that morning, would ensure they took only what truly belonged to them. The locks would be changed immediately afterward. Peggy attempted to approach me, her manipulation tactics shifting to remorse and nostalgia. "James, please, we have 7 years together. I made a terrible mistake, but we can work through this. I never stopped loving you." I stepped back, maintaining physical and emotional distance. "Save your performance. The divorce is final and you're trespassing in my home." Within days, the truth about their affair spread throughout our social circle. Friends who had been deceived by Peggy's portrayal of me as an unfeeling workaholic now understood the reality. Robert, humiliated and financially exposed, left the state. I heard through mutual connections that he'd moved to Florida to live with a cousin, his reputation in ruins. Peggy's fall was significant, though not as immediately catastrophic as Robert's. Having given up our apartment and spent much of her divorce settlement on luxury items she thought would furnish her new life in the mansion, she was forced to move into a small studio apartment in a much less prestigious part of town. She picked up part-time work at a local boutique, a far cry from the lifestyle she had envisioned for herself. Her carefully curated social media presence, once filled with designer purchases and expensive restaurant check-ins, went conspicuously quiet. Her frantic calls and emails escalated from apologies to threats, then back to desperate pleas for financial help. When she showed up at my workplace, causing a scene in the lobby and demanding I take responsibility for her situation, I was forced to file for a restraining order. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding. I renovated the mansion, removing the changes Robert had made and restoring it to the way my mother had loved it. Each room cleansed of their presence felt like reclaiming a piece of my family legacy. I established a small foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to supporting pancreatic cancer research, transforming the pain of betrayal into something that might help others. 1 year after the revelation, Peggy made one final attempt to reconcile. I found her sitting on the mansion's porch steps one evening. She was still well-dressed, but the designer clothes were last season's, and the luxury watch she'd always been so proud of was noticeably absent. Without access to the wealth she'd anticipated, maintaining her previous lifestyle had proven impossible. She tried to appeal to my compassion, claiming she'd realized the emptiness of material wealth and wanted a second chance at genuine connection. She spoke of therapy and personal growth, of recognizing how her obsession with status had led her astray. For a brief moment, seeing her vulnerability stirred something in me, not love or forgiveness, but a simple recognition of our shared humanity. But then I remembered my mother in her hospital bed, fighting for every breath while Peggy was betraying us both, and any impulse toward clemency vanished. "The police are already on their way," I told her calmly. "The restraining order is still in effect." She was escorted from the property for the final time. I haven't heard from her since. People often ask if I regret not exposing them sooner, if the months of knowing while pretending ignorance took a toll on me. The truth is, those months were necessary, not just for legal strategy, but for my own understanding of what justice meant to me. Quick revenge might have been emotionally satisfying, but it would have been incomplete. By waiting, by letting them believe they had won, I ensured that the lesson was indelible. They lost not just the mansion and the money, but their dignity, their relationship with each other, and any sympathy from those around them. They were undone not primarily by my actions, but by the fundamental dishonesty of their own characters. I've since found a kind of peace I never thought possible in the aftermath of such betrayal. The mansion no longer feels haunted by deception. Instead, it's become a space of healing, where my mother's memory is honored and my own future has room to unfold. I've even begun dating again, cautiously but with an openness that surprises me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about causing pain to those who hurt you. It's about reclaiming what was rightfully yours all along, not just property or possessions, but your sense of self, your capacity for trust, and your right to move forward unburdened by others' betrayal. It's been 2 years now. I still live in the mansion my mother loved, surrounded by memories of her strength rather than the shadow of their betrayal. And on difficult days when the past threatens to resurface, I remind myself of a simple truth that carried me through the darkest moments. Justice doesn't always arrive in a thunderclap of immediate retribution. Sometimes it builds slowly, deliberately, until the perfect moment of clarity when truth cannot be denied. And in that moment of clarity, nothing is more powerful than the simple statement of fact. It was never his to give.